It's working. Okay. Okay. So, what's the most valuable thing in your house?
People.
What's that? The people? Well, how much are they worth?
Priceless.
Priceless. So, when we talk about value, it can be very slippery because the first answer, like you said, it could be a person. It's the most valuable thing. But if I asked you to put a price tag on that person, I'm guessing you couldn't. At least I hope that you wouldn't think, well, Judy, what can I sell her for? What's the going market? But on the other hand, if you were to think about the price taggable values, what might you answer? If you're looking at something that you could put a price tag on.
Oh, instead of people.
Instead of people.
If I had to save something, I'd probably try and grab the photo albums.
The photos? But I mean, do you have a very expensive fine art photo collection that could be sold at auction for thousands and thousands of dollars?
Okay.
They're irreplaceable.
They're irreplaceable?
The photos.
Okay, so the photos are except unless they're digital.
Yeah, just like people, they're, it's a sentimental sort of value that it's hard to put a price tag on.
So you're saying the photos are more important than, for example, the fridge?
Oh, yes.
But I'm pretty sure you spent more on the fridge than you did the photos.
Yeah.
At least. Depends on the fridge. It depends how many photos you may own.
Yeah, and if you're including the price of the many cameras over how many years.
True. So what you're saying is that value is kind of a tricky term to get, that there might be a price for something. And then we have things like fridges, TVs, furniture, other big ticket items that have a high price on the regular market, or perhaps you do have some fine art that could be sold at a fine art dealership for some amount. If your car is in the garage, if it fits in the garage, if it's not completely full, that may be the most expensive thing price-wise in the structure of your house. But if we're talking about worth or something that you place a great deal of value to, but which may or may not have anything like a high price tag, then you're looking at things that are irreplaceable and things that you couldn't even begin to put a number value to. Is that a fair representation of the group's consensus?
Yes.
Okay, which means it's going to be very tricky to navigate what we get in this week's Torah portion. Well, the second Torah portion. There are two parshiot for this week, Behar and Bechukotai. And we're going to be looking at Bechukotai in chapter 27. And we're going to be looking at something known as an erech vow. And an erech vow is a vow of worth, of value. Well, that's what we're going to have to navigate, because the language is not going to fit easily into what we've just discussed, which means we're going to have to stretch ourselves a little bit and look at things from a different point of view and hopefully understand its reflection, not just in the ancient world, but the modern world as well, and hopefully, ultimately, our own personal lives. So with that for the introduction, we are on page 753, chapter 27 of the book of Leviticus. We are in the very end of the book of Vayikra. Okay, so I need a volunteer, someone who would like to serve as designated reader. I was going to say, if you clear your throat, that means you're it. So.
Where are we starting? Beginning of 27?
The very beginning, verse 1. The Lord spoke.
The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when anyone explicitly vows to the Lord the equivalent for a human being, the following scale shall apply." Okay, so the word equivalent is our equivocal term. That is to say, it is a word that is slippery to work out. So the Hebrew word that we're going to use as a stand-in is erech.
And it can be variously translated as value, valuation, worth. It's definitely connected to some representation of the person as converted to a cash equivalent. But how that number is determined, that equivalent, is going to be the issue. Okay, so we're going to use the term erech. When you vow an erech of a person, this is what happens. This is the procedure. Okay, now I should point out, although we'll see this a bit more clearly in our source texts, when we say you're vowing this, what we are saying is that you are vowing to donate this amount of money to the Mishkan for the Torah, and then later for the temple, right? So it's the equivalent of you stand up in the synagogue and you say, I'm making a $5,000 pledge for my high holiday donation, right? Rather than saying I make a $5,000 pledge, you say I make an erech vow for Mr. Smith. So whatever Mr. Smith's erech is, that's how much I'm going to donate. Or whatever my erech is, that's how much I'm going to donate. All right, so it's a way of donating a set amount based upon this valuation. Make sense? Little tricky? Not exactly the way we normally do it nowadays, I know. Nowadays it's just bend over the tab. And the fact that you're vowing something that you may not be 100% aware of how much it is that you've made a pledge for is going to be an issue when we get to the halacha of this. Keep going.
If it is a male from 20 to 60 years of age, the equivalent is 50 shekels of silver by the sanctuary weight.
All right, now try and keep up with the numbers, but I do have a chart on the handout.
If it is a female, the equivalent is 30 shekels.
Okay, so what do we notice straight away? So if I say I vow the erech of Mr. Smith, and someone else says I vow the erech of Mrs. Smith, they're going to be different, right? On surface, at least so far, he's going to be 50, right? And she is going to be 30. Exactly. So she is going to be 3/5 what he is. Okay? Okay, now, does that mean she is worth only 60% of him? Or does that mean you have pledged to give 60% of what the other person pledged, and it has nothing to do with the value of the person? This is where I'm saying we need to really try and work out what the difference is between worth, value, or price. Are we saying that he is worth more in the same way that a photo collection might be worth more than a fridge, meaning if I was running out of a burning building, I would grab a man rather than grab her? Or are we saying that price-wise, he's more valuable than her, meaning that if we were selling both of them, he's going to fetch a higher price than she is? You can't answer this question yet, but you recognize that there is some odd implications, at least for the modern ears, of the notion that between different genders, and as we're going to see, different ages, we end up with a different value to the donation that has been pledged. So let's fill in our chart.
If the age is from 5 years to 20 years, the equivalent is 20 shekels for a male and 10 shekels for a female. If the age is from 1 month to 5 years, the equivalent for a male is 5 shekels of silver, and the equivalent for a female is 3 shekels of silver. If the age is 60 years or over, the equivalent is 15 shekels in the case of a male and 10 shekels for a female.
Okay, so let's pause there. So we've got our full chart now put in. So in addition to gender, what's our other determinant? Age. And for those of us who continue to get older, does this mean that the young and the elderly are worth less than those who are in their prime? Prime in quotes, going off the numbers. Right after I turn 60, I'm devalued. I'm on sale.
But the gap between male and female narrows.
Absolutely, absolutely. The gap between men and women narrows at the over 60 mark, and that is something not lost by our commentators. So that will come back to be part of our discussion. But good mathematical eye. You can see the ratio had narrowed for that one. All right. Well, let's finish off the implications on another dimension.
But if one cannot afford the equivalent, he shall be presented before the priest, and the priest shall assess him. The priest shall assess him according to what the vower can afford.
Okay, so the erech vow, right? This vow that we're making of an erech for another person or ourselves is set in stone, right? Or at least set in scroll. That it is 50 for this, and 30 for that, and 10 for this, and 15 for that. But if you can't afford 50, but you pledged 50,
you can still go to the priest and get dispensation to reduce it to what you can afford.
You'll get a reduction. You go to the priest says, well, you're poor. So it appears that all you can afford is X, and therefore you can fulfill your pledge of the erech pledge, this value pledge, by giving less. Even though the Torah just finished going through this entire matrix of what everybody was based upon gender and age. So we have three different determinants of how much you're going to end up paying. Right? First, the person that is chosen as the benchmark, whoever you say the erech is according to this person, is going to be judged by age, judged by gender, and then the pledger, the person who makes the vow, the vower. The person who makes the vow becomes the third dimension for the final tally based upon their own personal wealth. Slippery, yes? And all of this in just 8 sentences. So let's see, first of all, if we can't make sure we understand the way this works, and then we'll see what it might mean. Okay, so if you look at the chart at the top of the handout, we've got our breakdown from what we just saw. So from the ages of 1 month to 5 years, if it is a male that you have chosen as your designee for the erech vow, you'll pay 5, and if it's a woman, you'll pay 3. And that means the difference between them is 60%, right? The woman's valuation for this vow is 60% of what a male's valuation would be for the same age. And that, like I said, is 60% or 3/5. Take your pick of how you would like to represent it. When the person is 5 years old to 20 years old, for a man it would be 20, and for a woman it would be 10, which means the man's valuation has gone up by 400%, and the woman's valuation has gone up by 333%. And now the difference has actually widened, right? 10 to 20, we're looking at 50%. Makes sense? So the woman is only half the value of the man. Following it so far, right? We're doing our math class. When we get to 20 to 60, the largest category and the peak valuation, men are valued at 50 and women valued at 30, which means the man has only gone up by 250% from where he was at age 20, and the woman has gone up by 300% from where she was at age 20, and the difference is now back to 60%, or 3/5 between them. We're doing all right. And then, as Miriam pointed out, once we reach the golden years of 60 and over, the man's valuation drops down to 15%, which is only 30% of where it was before, and the woman's drops down to 10, which is only 33% of where it was before, which means she drops less, and in a sense catches up, and is now only 66% of where the man was. All right, how are we doing? So one way to look at this is, rather than saying it is price or value in the sense of what price tag you would put on a person, is to look at the earning potential for this person. their economic contribution to society at any given time. And you might think, well, that's terrible. I mean, how can we judge what worth a person might have by age or by gender for their economic contribution to society? But we do that all the time. I mean, the modern world, we do exactly the same calculations. We're not as explicit about it as the Torah, but if you look at the statistics of the earning potential and earning discrepancies within America, women make about 20% less than similarly qualified men. And that gap is much larger in some fields. It's a little narrower in some others. But when you compound that with the limitations often on promotion and other forms of advancement for women, it actually works out that the average woman will have an earning potential of only 60% of the average man over the course of her lifetime. Sound familiar? Right? So before we start thinking, well, we're modern people and we're so advanced and we would never value a woman at only 60% worth of a man, on average, the paychecks that women take home do exactly that. We are actually, on average, continually paying women about 60% over the span of their lifetime what we would pay for a man to do the same amount of work. So we haven't changed the price we put on the contribution. But what's different here is that this is not saying a woman should be paid less than a man. It's saying a vow in the name of a man or a woman should be tallied at a different level. Right? The Torah nowhere says a woman should receive an inferior salary. American economics seems to be saying that. And by the way, we do the same for many minority groups, most especially for African Americans, who also, same level of education, same training, same skills, will receive about the same deduction from their white counterparts. The Torah never says that's a good idea. They just say if someone's making a pledge, if someone's making a vow, and they use another person or themselves as the benchmark for how much they are willing to donate, that benchmark should reflect the realities of the earning potential of these different people and different ages and different genders. It never says that it's good that the earning potential is different. It just says it is. Does that make sense? There's a difference, and this is very, very important in many parts of Torah and Jewish law. There's a difference between a descriptive ruling and a prescriptive ruling. Right? There's a difference between the Torah saying, this is the way society is structured, and therefore we will make rulings based upon this arrangement in order that we can reflect the reality, and saying the reality is good and should be the way it is. Right? So oftentimes the Torah will deal with a descriptive topic and say this is just the way it is, and this is the way it is, then that means we need to reflect it in certain laws. And other times the Torah will say this is the way it ought to be, and we will reflect it in certain laws. This is a descriptive reality. And if you're pledging the worth of a person, society in their day and to our own day seems to consistently undervalue the productivity, the labor, the economic potential, whatever you want to call it, of women and people of different ages. And that should be reflected then in what your pledge will be assessed as. Does that make sense? Maybe? Not exactly chauvinistic, but calling it like it looks. Right? This is the way their reality was structured, and please don't get on a high horse. Our reality is very, very similar in real terms, even though we have many different aspirations, and hopefully those will be fulfilled, and we have made progress. We have not escaped many of these differentiations in our real world, real number, on the ground, how people actually live reality. Okay, but why not just say, well, figure out how much Mr. Smith is worth? Why only determine by gender and by age? Why not determine by individuality, right? Because Mr. Smith could be a brain surgeon, or Mr. Smith could be a layabout bum. So shouldn't that be the determination that goes with my vow? And Abarbanel, in his brilliant, succinct way, gives us an answer for why we don't do it just individually.
The Torah did not want human beings to be valued individually like horses or donkeys.
Right? You don't want to drag Mr. Smith in front of the priest and have the priest look him over and go through his 1040 and assess exactly the economic potential of Mr. Smith before I get to know how much I'm going to be giving as my donation. The Torah is not going to say that's how we value people.
Yeah.
We're going to look at a variation on this law, an option where people do exactly that. But Abarbanel is pointing out that the Torah does not recommend such behavior. That the Torah says, look, if you want to make a pledge in value measured by a particular person, which, by the way, no one is ever required to make such a pledge, but if you choose to do so, this is the way we're going to count. We're going to look at age, and we're going to look at gender, and we're done. We're not going to be counting the teeth. Okay? And the issue of the discrepancy between women and men is explained by Abarbanel as follows.
One would expect a woman's worth would be half the man's, but since she is capable of bearing children at this stage of life, her worth is boosted by 5 shekels.
Okay, so looking at the ages between 20 and 60, Abarbanel is basically saying, well, you might have thought that a woman would just be 50%. Why this awkward, boost? Because remember, it had been 50% in the previous age, 5 to 20. And they say, well, the woman's economic contribution gets a boost because she's able to make more economic contributors. She's able to have children. Note, by the way, that Abarbanel, in his mind, is suggesting that it is at least the age 20 and later that is the most natural and normal time for women to have children. The idea that women should be having children as 13, 14, or 15-year-old does not seem to him to be normal, because otherwise he would have expected a 5-point boost in the ages between 5 and 20. But it's at 20 that this childbearing kicks in. And that's his explanation for why there's a boost. Maybe. But then we also have to deal with the opposite issue, right? Marion's point of what about when they retire? Because by proportion, that's when a woman is most valuable. And at 60, I can tell you in the ancient and medieval world, women were not having children. We may be able to do certain miracles of IVF nowadays for women in their 60s who do want to have children. I think that's just about where the world record is currently standing. But certainly in pre-modern science times, women were not getting a 5-point boost for having children in the age of 60.
How many were living then?
Well, all that did.
That's not right.
Well, all that did.
Right.
I mean, one of the ironies of when we talk about life expectancy is we tend to think of life expectancy as being the most common age to which people live. But that's not what life expectancy means. Life expectancy means it's the average age to which people live, which means people who die very young and people who die very old balance themselves out in the middle. And if a woman was able to get past the childhood illnesses that affected everybody and was able to get past the dangers of childbirth, she had just as good a chance to live to a ripe old age as any man did. It's just women face that extra danger of childbirth that men didn't face. And so, yes, on average in the ancient and classical and medieval worlds, women's life expectancy was lower. But once they made it past that hurdle, living to 60 and 70 and 80 was not rare. It was just a big hurdle to get past at that point. Okay, so why might, according to Behar-Shor, women be valued disproportionately more when they reach their golden years?
Ordinarily, a man will work at his full strength. When he gets older and weaker, he cannot do as much, and so his worth is less, for he never learned a lighter trade. A woman does lighter work, and hence loses less of her capability as she ages.
Interesting insight, right? At least into the ancient and classical worlds, where much of the man's labor for average, and the Erech is talking about average, much of the man's labor was more physical. in a brute strength kind of way than much of the labor for women. Not to say that women didn't work hard. Much of their labor was very hard compared to what we're used to these days. But compared to the men of the days, the men did tend to have heavier, straight up brute labor than a woman did. And as you get older, your ability to do that kind of work diminishes. And it diminishes much faster the harder the work was that you did in your prime. Does that make sense? Right? If your job was lumberjack, then as soon as you can't swing that giant axe, your economic contribution begins to fall very, very rapidly. Whereas if you were a weaver, you may not be able to carry quite as heavy of bales of wool here and there to get things set up on the loom, but most of what you do at the loom, you can still do much longer than the lumberjack could have done. And so the worth, the economic contribution or potential of women in old age is more durable than that of somebody who relied on a more physical manual labor. Make sense? So yay for having those slightly lighter duties. Of course, remember, for anybody who lived in the pre-modern time, their lightest duties would have been heavy for any of us. It's just hard to imagine how hard they had to work just to survive. Okay, let's get down to brass tacks though, because this is a nice sort of theory of where we're getting these valuations from their worth, their economic contribution, but what does it look like to actually do the vow? Who can do the vow, and what do these vows mean? And so we're going to look at some of the halachot from Rambam's Mishnah Torah on this point.
A valuation may be pledged for a non-Jew, but the pledge of a Gentile is of no consequence.
All right, let's make sure we understand that. So if I say, and the word valuation is standing in here for erech, if I say I pledge the erech of Mr. Non-Jew, we'll just use as whatever generic name you want to fill in the blank, of Chris Christensen. There we go. I want to pledge the value of Chris Christensen as a donation to the temple. That's fine. The priest would say, well, how old is he? And is it a he or a she? And then that will give you your set, and then the priest will have to evaluate your own ability to pay, and then that's the contribution you make. Make sense? But if Mr. Chris Christensen comes to the temple and says, I would like to make an erech vow for Mr. Cohen or myself or anything, they say, I'm sorry, but if you'd like to make a donation, you can make a donation, but you can't make that kind of donation. You can't make an erech vow if you are a non-Jew. You can be the benchmark, but you can't be the vower. Does that, in its simplest sense, make sense?
No.
No. So the question would be, why not? And it comes down to the idea that non-Jews are not subject to the laws of vows and pledges because they are not bound by the covenant that governs those pledges and vows. And so they can't make a pledge. They can make a donation, but they can't make a pledge that then has to becomes a debt. And actually, that's let me go ahead and point that out now rather than later, because I think that might help. Although we're going to talk about it in more detail in a few minutes. When you make, we're doing a timeline here, right? You make the vow, right? You say, I vow for Mr. Smith, Mr. Cohen, Mr. Shapiro, Mrs. Johnson, whatever you like. Then there comes the point of valuation. And then there is the point of payment, right? So first you vow, then the priest makes the valuation, says, well, that's going to cost X, Y, and Z. And then you take the cash and you pay. Now, we may think of this as being, 1, 2, 3 minutes of process, but it could very well have been that the person made the vow, and then they had to go to the temple, which might have been next week, it might have been next month, it might have been next year. And then once the valuation had been made, it might have taken considerable time before the person could pay off their vow, pay off that debt. And this time where they are in debt for their vow, is going to be governed by Torah, because pledges and vows made by Jews are governed by the laws of which vows and pledges and debts we do, and how they are handled, what can be seized as collateral, what cannot be seized as collateral, which means that this time period is only governable by people who are bound by the covenant. Now, if someone just wants to show up and do a payment, and as I say, someone just shows up to the temple and says, "I'd like to give, 1,000 gold coins to the temple," that's great. Jew, non-Jew, sacrifices, payments were accepted by everyone. But this debt period, this vowing period, would only be governed for people who were bound by the covenant. So that's where the distinction comes in. Does that make a little more sense? So it's not saying that non-Jews can't make a donation. It's saying they can't make this type of donation because they don't fall under our jurisdiction when it comes to debt collection, because they're not bound by the Torah. Maybe a little bit. So it's not discriminatory. It's jurisdictional. It's like saying, well, if you'd like to make a loan to somebody in South Africa, that's fine, but you can't do it by American law. You have to do it by South African law because you're not a citizen here. So go to South Africa or draw up South African documents or whatever you would do. I'm not a lawyer. Please do not take this as being legal advice, and take care of it according to South African laws, and that's fine. But if you're not an American citizen, then American jurisdiction wouldn't apply on that category, and that's all that's being stated by this. All right, onward.
When a Jew says, "I pledge the valuation of this non-Jew," or "I pledge the valuation of so-and-so, the Gentile," he must pay according to the age of the non-Jew. Similarly, if one pledges the valuation of a deaf-mute or an intellectually or emotionally unstable person, he is obligated to pay according to that person's age.
All right, so according to the Erech Halacha, the Jewish law covering this vow in greater detail, you can say, I pledge the Erech, I pledge the valuation of this person who is locked away in the insane asylum. And the priest is not going to say, well, you get a reduction because they're crazy. Even though if you were purchasing them, if we were talking about that individual's actual value, it's greatly reduced because of their insanity. The erech is not reduced. They are counted, valued, treated, however you want to call it, as the same as any other representative of their gender and age. So is that good or bad? We're saying that are they worth then the same as everyone else? Or are we ignoring the distinctions that make them unique from everyone else?
It's a good thing, I think, because then you're not going into all of the trouble of, well, first, you're not putting anybody on the spot to have the priest evaluate their value in front of everybody. You're not going to embarrass people. And
there's no horse
less
trading.
Discriminatory.
Right.
Less discriminatory.
Less discriminatory. There's no horse trading. There's no checking the teeth. There's no giving the person a physical examination to figure out their value. Which, by the way, when you want to get insured, especially for life insurance, is exactly the process you go through, where the company will determine precisely, at least according to their best estimate, what you are worth, alive and dead, and then figure out your payments according to that. And by the actuaries figure out how likely you are to die before they've collected enough money from you to make it worthwhile for them. This is saying you don't do that. It's saying it doesn't matter whether the person is a lunatic, it doesn't matter whether the person is a deaf mute, who in the ancient world, prior to all the interventions and developments of the Helen Keller miracle and such, were, for all intents and purposes, essentially isolated from the world and people who lacked the capacity to interact in a meaningful way. And so they were lumped in that same category as being people that you generally would not value for their economic contribution because they couldn't. But for the erech vow, they are treated the same. We are not giving you a discount on your pledge just because the person happens to be insane. And we're going to get more examples of that as we go. But first, we have a little interlude.
A valuation may be pledged for a servant, and he may pledge a valuation like any member of the Jewish people.
Now, a servant here, I have to admit, is a bit of a euphemism. We're talking about a slave. But it's an indentured servant. It's not chattel slavery, but this is somebody that would have had their time for a large period of their life owned by another person. They can be the object of an erech vow. You can say, I pledge, the valuation of my slave, Mr. Smith. And Mr. Smith, the slave, can likewise make a vow and say, I pledge that I will donate the valuation of myself, the slave, or my owner, or anybody else that the person chooses. Surprising? That a slave can make a binding debt obligation that they then need to pay?
But if he's a non-Jew.
Well, slaves could be Jews.
Yeah, so we're assuming in this discussion.
In this instance of the slave, we're assuming that he is a Jew, yes. Because otherwise he wouldn't be able to make the pledge in the first place. But a Jewish slave can make a binding pledge
Same
as any other. Now, most of us are used to the notion that if you're a slave, you have no property, right? Because you are property. Judaism did not view it that same way. Yes, it was true that in many cases a slave would not have much of their own property, but a slave might have some property as well, which is why the halacha continues.
If he is redeemed and he has financial resources, he should pay the pledge that he vowed.
Right, so if he does have any money, or if he is redeemed and now free and able to earn money, then this time period here may be very, very long between the valuation and the payment, but once he goes free, he pays. So the vow that he made while a slave is still binding. Even though generally slaves didn't have a lot of economic freedom, for this particular form of donation to the temple, of an act of sanctification of this money, they could do it even while a slave. And the valuation, both for them or by them, would not be changed because of their slave status.
Yeah. If I recall correctly, if one Jew becomes enslaved to another Jew, it's for a limited time period.
Correct.
Yeah.
So, and actually that's covered in the earlier sections of this double parasha, that a person is a slave only through the sabbatical. That is to say, for the 7-year cycle, wherever they happen to start their slavery, it ends after that 7-year cycle ends. Everybody's on the same cycle. And if the slave says, no, I really like it here, I want to stay, then they can stay. But at the end of the Jubilee, which is the seven cycles, that is to say, after 49 years, they go free whether they like it or not. So even a slave who would like to stay as this servant to their master can be forced to be free at the Jubilee. But yes, the average person would have gone free at the sabbatical, assuming that they were, like most people, quite interested in regaining their freedom after that period of having to have sold their services for whatever reason. So yes, the person has the potential to go free, always built in. But they might go free even earlier by being redeemed by a relative or by having their own financial resources to redeem themselves. And notice their redemption comes before their payment, right? So you don't say, well, look, you owe this money to the temple, so pay that first, and then if you have money left over, redeem yourself. It's saying, no, the slave can use whatever money is available to him or her to redeem, and then they can pay off the debt as well. So this is one of the few things that can postpone the payment of this debt, is paying for your own redemption. But after that, then the debt is due. Make sense? Maybe? I know. It's a little, it's what was the term? An exotic financial instrument that was used for the stock market nonsense.
Who is responsible for making sure
The priests, the Kohanim.
They are.
They are responsible. They keep track of the debt, and they are the ones who collect the debt. And collection was vigorous on these debts. That is to say, once a person had made the pledge, collateral could be seized, and what we would call garnishing of wages could occur, and payment could be extracted. It did not wait necessarily for the person to finally show up with payment. If they had it, they paid when the priest came knocking at the door, so to speak. It's a little different than modern day pledges and donations. Yeah, where people say, I pledged $10,000, and 5 years go by, and it's like,
But this pledge is entirely voluntary.
The pledge is voluntary. Before you make the vow, you have 100% choice of whether you want to make the vow or not. Once you've made the vow, you do not get to back out of it. And that's a very important part of where we're headed in this analysis, is the fact that it's 100% voluntary until you've done it. And once that happens, you have relinquished your voluntarism at the moment that you made a vow, at the moment you swore this oath.
What situations would present themselves to make a person want to make a vow if it was totally?
Well, people make. So why would people want to make a vow? Well, people made vows all the time, and this was a unique measure of how much you wanted to dedicate. But the Torah portion goes on to talk about dedicating animals or dedicating other items or other things to the temple. This was a unique way to make a pledge by having a valuation that wasn't just, I'm picking $5,000. It was, as we might say nowadays, I'm making a donation in honor of Mr. Smith. And rather than just saying, I'm going to fill in the blank on the donation form, it was, whatever Mr. Smith is worth by this measure, that's how much I'm doing. But it's entirely voluntary. It's just what happens once you've made that declaration, that your free will is then removed because you have made this vow, you have made this obligation real. And we're going to talk about some of the difficulties that comes in with that process. So, on the back.
Whether a person pledges the valuation of an attractive, healthy person or one who is ugly and infirm, he must give the fixed amount specified by the Torah according to the age of that person. Even if that person has leprous blotches, is blind, lacking a limb, or possesses any type of blemish.
All right, so just to drive the point home that we were saying earlier about whether a person was a slave or not a slave, whoever they are, or whether they were insane or not insane, whoever they are, doesn't matter. Their age, their gender, that's it. There is no other point taken into consideration when coming up with the valuation, right? So if you say, I am going to pledge to donate the erech of Mr. Smith, and Mr. Smith is a blind, one-legged hunchback who has leprosy and is insane, it does not matter if you said Mr. Smith or said Mr. Brad Pitt. It is exactly the same amount that you are going to donate when you go to the temple, assuming they're the same age. Does that make sense? Right? So this is a radical statement of equality that says if you're donating if you're going to make a pledge to donate the valuation of a human being, then there are a couple things we're going to take in consideration: gender and age and your own wealth. But apart from that, we are not going to value each person. We are instead going to simply give the valuation of that category. And it doesn't matter what the individual is. Does that make sense? Yeah, so it is in many ways a very interesting reflection of the differentiation in society, but then stripped of all of differentiation and radically equal once you get past that first hurdle, right? So gender and age was a massive impact on their economic contribution, but after that, no other considerations were taken into account.
It's very different than today's world.
Yes, we are much more prone to putting price tags on people. These are the 10 richest people, the 10 best paid athletes, or the highest grossing movie stars. We are obsessed with people's net worth or their gross earnings or all of these other things. And this essentially was saying, if you're going to donate the valuation of a person, then you're donating the valuation of a person. And we're going to take a couple things into account, but that's it. And we're stopping there. As Abravanel said at the very beginning, we're not doing horse trading. So it doesn't matter whether the hoof is this or the hoof is that. It just matters, is it a horse? Okay. But you could do something differently, which is going to bring us to the second.
Pledges for a person's value are not like valuations.
All right, so there's another type of pledge called demeh that can be made that is, it's hard to get the translation right because they're very different sounding in Hebrew, but when you translate them into English, they are as hard to work out as price and worth and value of what we're talking about. But here, what we're talking about value, well, you'll see what's made clear of how we do it.
What is implied? When a person says, I am responsible for my value, I am responsible for that person's value, or I am responsible for the value of so-and-so, he must pay the value of that person as if he were sold as a servant in the marketplace, whether it be a dinar or 1,000 dinars.
Right? So if you want to pledge the value of a person, not the valuation, not the erech, but you want to pledge the value, meaning the price of that person, then you do horse trading. Then you really do look the person up and down, tap the teeth, and check the hair and all of that, and say, well, how much would you have to pay to buy this person from the auction block in the market? And the halacha is not saying that is what you should do. It's saying that's how different it could be. But the Torah talks about the erech vow as a specific category. The Torah never talks about this second category. But people can be creative, right? So, I mean, I could go to the priest and say, I pledge the value of this chair. And then the priest would go, okay, I guess, take it to Antique Roadshow and figure out what it's worth and then tell you how much it is. And that means getting the actual price of the chair. The Torah doesn't say you should do that. The Torah says if you want to do a vow for a person as the measure, it should be an erech vow. But if you want to get creative and say, I want to donate the value of Mr. Smith, or I want to donate the value of Mr. Smith's arm, which is another example that's given, or I want to donate my weight in gold, or I want to donate as many jelly beans as there are in the jar, you can come up with any vow you can imagine, and the priest will be forced to have to figure out exactly the worth. The erech vow, however, was the only one the Torah talked about. And the halacha is trying to make it very clear that unlike these creative vows that someone might make, where you would have to assess the individual cost of a person, the erech vow that the Torah laid out had nothing to do with that. The erech vow that the Torah laid out was entirely the opposite of putting someone on the auction block in the marketplace. Make sense? Maybe? Right? So the halacha wants to show us that someone could creatively come up with something that sounds similar, but it is not the same. It may sound similar because we're talking about the value of a person, but there's a difference between value and valuation. Yes? No? Maybe? I just hope I'm getting this clear. All right. Let's go ahead and push through the next bit from Rambam, and then we're going to get to the punchline.
All of the valuations that are explicitly mentioned in the Torah are to be given when the one who makes the pledge is wealthy.
Right, so we're still talking about the erech here. We're not talking about the guy on the block. The guy on the block, 1 dinar, 1,000 dinar, it's a big range. An erech vow, 50, 30, etc., and those are the numbers if the person who is choosing to make the pledge is wealthy. Right? Not the person being valued, but the person who is choosing to make the pledge. If they're wealthy, they're paying 50. Go ahead.
If, however, he was poor and he does not have the means, he gives everything he possesses, even if it is only a selah, and he fulfills his obligation.
Right? So if you are poor and you make the declaration of I pledge the value of Mr. Smith, and Mr. Smith is a 25-year-old and male, then you are on the hook for 50 if you're rich, and if you're poor, you're on the hook for whatever you got. And if whatever you've got is a sela, which is like an inconsequential amount of money, very, very small quantity, then you pay that. And then you are done with your obligation. And by done with the obligation, the halacha is trying to say you are done with the obligation. It's not a down payment. It's not you will continue to pay later. It's you are done, free and clear. You have paid what you pledged. Because what you pledged was always subject to modification by the priest based upon their assessment of your ability to pay. And clearly, if you've given everything you can, and that goes into much more detail in halacha of what is left for the person, mattress and blankets and certain types of clothes and tools of a trade, et cetera, et cetera. But everything apart from that, all of your what we would call disposable income or disposable assets would be liquidated, and you would make the vow and you would fulfill your vow. And if you only had a sela's worth to give, fine, you have fulfilled your vow. And if you had, 49 shekels rather than 50, fine, you give 49. And if you had 5,000 shekels, you give 50.
So once you pay with using the sela,
Mhm.
foundation, that's it. And even if you come into money,
That's what we're moving on to.
okay.
So you're anticipating beautifully.
If the person does not possess even a selah, we do not take less than a selah from him. Instead, the entire amount is considered as a debt incumbent upon him. If he acquires property and becomes wealthy, he must pay a full valuation as prescribed by the Torah.
All right, so if he has less than a selah, which means he is very poor indeed, then we say, okay, you know what, we're going to keep our, let's just use 50 for the moment, we're going to keep our 50 valuation, and then along the way, he hits the lottery, so now he has $5 billion. Then we say, great, that'll be 50, please. And he pays the full amount. We don't lower the amount to a selah and then wait for him to get a selah. We keep the amount at 50. And then if he becomes wealthy, he pays the 50. And if he gets more than that, he pays what he can and it's cleared. But if he gets wealthy enough that he can pay the 50, then he pays the 50, which means the priest's judgment of what he can pay only happens at the time of payment. It doesn't happen at the time of valuation. So his ability to pay is held in question. It's a cloud until he actually comes to pay. And when he comes to pay, if he is now rich, then he will pay the full amount. And if he can pay only a selah at that time, he will pay a selah. And anywhere in between. Okay, a little bit more.
When a rich person pledged and then became poor, or when a poor person pledged and became wealthy, he must give a full valuation.
All right, so if you were wealthy at the time, and for some reason you delayed in fulfilling your vow, in fulfilling your pledge, and then you lost it all, you are on the hook for the full amount because you shouldn't have delayed in making good on your pledge. That was your choice not to pay it when you could. And in kind of the flip version, if somebody is poor, but by the time they get to pay their pledge, they are now wealthy, they can't say, yeah, but I was poor when I made the pledge, so I should only have to pay the poor amount. No. If you had come to pay while you were still poor, then yes, you would have only paid a little bit. But if there is any gap between the valuation and payment, and something happens to change your wealth in the middle, the payment will reflect what you should have paid at the time or what you can pay now to the maximum benefit of the pledge. Okay? Okay, because all of this ultimately comes down to what you pledged, to what you chose, as we pointed out before, Susan, what you chose to say, what you chose to promise. When you chose to make that promise, you were creating a situation. Now, we don't do this anymore. As the Talmud goes on to say in Avodah Zarah,
People at this time are not to sanctify or declare cherem or vow the value of anything.
All right, so let's make sure we understand here. You should not go around saying, I declare the value of, Mr. Smith as a donation for the temple, because there is no temple to give it to. But you have still done something. You have still created an obligation. If you say it, even if you can't fulfill it, you are still bound by that obligation, and you are in trouble. And that goes whether it be an erech vow, whether it be another form of dedication, or whether it be another form of prescription, which is the term harem here is referring to. We're not talking about a harem with a bunch of women in it. We're talking about a harem, which is when you say, this will no longer be used because it is now dedicated. And that is not something we say now as a meaningful vow. And if one has
sanctified or declared cherem or vowed the valuation of something.
If you do this anyway because you were rash or impulsive or somehow you thought this would earn you favor with God,
a beast is to be disabled. Fruit, clothes, or utensils are to be allowed to rot. Money or metal utensils are to be disposed of in the salt sea.
That's what we call the Dead Sea, by the way.
What is the meaning of disabled? The beast is to be locked up and left to starve to death.
Right? So the Avodah Zarah is trying to explain that in the time when there is no temple to take these things to, or to have the valuation done so that you can pay off your obligation, these things become inaccessible to you. They have been dedicated now with no outlet at the other end. But just because they have no outlet doesn't mean your words were nothing. Your words still change their status. And therefore, these things are no longer allowed to be used for regular activities. And so you pledge to donate your cow to the temple, and there is no temple. Don't think, woohoo, I got like a tax break for nothing. That cow is now dedicated to the temple. You cannot go milk it for yourself. You cannot slaughter it for your own meat. You cannot hook it up to your plow and make it plow your field. All you can do with it is let it die. You can't even kill it in order to end its own suffering. And then the Talmud goes into the pain of this issue. But you can't even kill it to end its own suffering because you would then be slaughtering something that belonged to the temple. And you're not allowed to kill something that belongs to the temple because it's not yours anymore. So the only thing you can do with the poor beast is just leave it to starve. Which the Talmud, I hope you can see, is trying to say is a horrible, horrible situation to get yourself into. And when you're chucking pots and pans into the Dead Sea because you and no one else in the world is allowed to use them, it's the equivalent of throwing them into a furnace so they can be just destroyed and obliterated. That's not what you're supposed to do. But how do we get into this mess? Leaving Bessie to die in the barn. How did this happen?
Making a vow by choice.
Because you said something. Because you made a vow, which is where our final text from Sefer HaChinuch is going to come in.
At the root of this mitzvah is that a human only becomes a partner with the upper realms by means of speech. For this is the whole of the glorified portion within him or her. Therefore, in all circumstances, one is obligated to fulfill his word, which he uses for matters of heaven.
Right? When we speak, we are using the most perfect part of our humanity, according to Sefer HaChinuch and many of our theologians over the centuries. Speech is the most godly aspect. It is the most human aspect within us, which is why we say blessings before we do a mitzvah. We don't just do the mitzvah. Because by saying it, we are focusing and utilizing our most beautiful human aspect of our intelligence, our rationality, our transcendence above the mundane, material, and animal of this world. And we are partnering with God. Our rational faculties, as reflected through speech, are, according to many of our greatest thinkers, what it means to have been made in the image of God. And so when we use them, we are literally partnering with the upper realms, with God, to change the world. And we are changing the world by changing the status of these things when we make these vows. Right? The cow that was just a cow the day before is now a holy cow dedicated to the temple. And the difference between yesterday and today wasn't the shape of the cow, it wasn't the form of the cow, it wasn't because I moved the cow from here to there, it was because of what I said. Two people who prior to today were just good friends are now husband and wife. Why? Because of what they said. And because of what they said under the chuppah, and because of the blessings that were said while they were under the chuppah. They just walked under the chuppah and passed rings back and forth, and nothing was said. They're not married. They're not married. It's what they say that transforms the world. When we speak, we are partners with God. And as such, when we vow, our vows are real. They're not just words. And as such, for the rest of our life, when we speak, we are shaping the world. We are using our most godly gift of creation every time we open our mouth. And that's why what we say is so important, and why the halakha is so careful of trying to dissuade us from saying the wrong thing when it comes to holy matters, or the wrong thing that comes to human matters, of how we speak to other people, of how we avoid insulting or gossiping or deceiving other people. It's not just because it's not nice to do those things, but because it is an ultimate perversion of our most sublime quality, of our most godliness as represented through our speech, as being the physical manifestation of what is most pure within us. So that's why vows matter. It's not just because you should always keep your promises. It's because if you break it, you have undone that which is most transcendent within you, and you have allowed it to become blemished beyond belief. You have taken what is the image of God and instead turned it into the mere reflection of what holiness should be, whether it be with a vow for the temple, or whether it be a promise to a friend, or whether it be gossip behind someone's back. Our words matter. Questions?
Yes.
Yes.
The value of a shekel.
Is hard to know. So there's been a lot of different debates of how much the shekel of biblical times was worth or not worth. It was a goodly amount. It was not an insane amount. That's the best I can give it to you. So, in modern times, it would probably help you to imagine it of saying this, 50 shekels for a person to have vowed would probably have been, worth as much as a car in a modern time. Probably not a house, but probably about as much as a car. Certainly a lot more than just a nice dinner. How much exactly it meant economically to the people of the time is very hard for us to know, because they didn't leave a lot of their financial receipts.
So it could be a real sacrifice.
Oh, definitely the vows were considerable. I mean, an erech vow was not chump change, which is why you had to be wealthy to even make the 50. Chances were, according to the way the rabbis viewed it, most people would have a devaluation from 50 for their average payment. If that was the wealthy level, everyone else would have a reduction. So just like today, the average person wasn't wealthy, or else wealthy would have been redefined, which meant the average person would have been taking a deduction from this. It would have been a very big sacrifice to make that full 50 vow. If you go online, you can find a lot more of the different estimates of exactly how many ounces of silver or other metals a shekel might or might not have been. But you'll also find a huge range of opinions on exactly what it was worth economically for the people in its day. Because if you say it's an ounce of silver, what would that have bought you? What would that have done? Yeah, it's like, so? It's like saying something's $1. If you don't tell me what $1 can buy, telling me that it's $1 doesn't help me. Okay? Okay. Be careful what you say.